First of all, when you look at trade deals, you're not necessarily just looking at it in terms of the actual percentage of exports and so forth and goods and so on. You do trade deals for lots of reasons. Unfortunately, Trump has pulled the US out of what I would think is a very good trade deal, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But that was launched to create a high-level agreement that dealt with the new problems in trade, the barriers not only at the border, but the barriers inside the border. That agreement dealt very well with those kinds of problems. The UK and the US have sufficiently close economic ties. We are a major services exporter to the United States, so it's not just goods. And we are a major investor in the United States, and they are a major investor in us. And so because we have that relationship, and because of the shared values that we have on trade and competition and rule of law and property rights and all these things, it is likely that we can get with the US a very, very high-level agreement. And that high-level agreement will help us in our trade relationships with other countries as well. So there's a trade strategic point here as well, that you want to get very good deals with the people you can get very good deals with. China, India, all of these other countries are very important markets for us, but we will take some time to get a good trade deal with those countries. With the US and with countries like Australia and New Zealand, we can get good trade deals quite quickly. When you do a trade negotiation, the NHS, Americans understand the role that the NHS plays in the UK life and in the UK economy. And I can tell you, as having been on the negotiating side, on the US side, that the NHS is not the thing that the US wants to attack in a trade agreement. The US has very many other things that it wants to deal with in a trade agreement. And a lot of that comes from, to Stella's point before, when Trump talks about Mexico and he talks about the tariff, he's not talking about the wall. What he's talking about and what he's tapped into, and we have to recognize this, he won the election because he tapped into a feeling in the country. And that feeling was that the terms of trade around the world have somehow been unfair for people. That free trade without competition or without dealing with these barriers behind the border in countries like China and in developing countries have not been dealt with. That's why we had Redcar and Port Talbot in the UK, because of China distortions in the steel sector. He's recognized the same problems in Mexico and in other countries, and that's the reason he won this election. And we have to recognize that his trade policy is going to come out of that wellspring. It's going to articulate trying to deal with those issues.
Would a British government, do you think, be able to accept a deal which the Americans would presumably want, because they're very frustrated by the agricultural terms that prevent them being in the EU, do a deal that involves us accepting chlorine-washed chickens, for example? It sounds daft and it sounds small beer, but I'm told that one of the great presidents, Kennedy, when there was a great row going on, said, "Are we going to break down this relationship with Europe because of chickens?" It was so serious.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of coverage about chlorinated chickens and washed chickens and beef hormones and so forth. And obviously there are beef farmers in the US who would like that type of access to the UK or to anywhere else in the world. And the same with the chlorinated chickens. But we have to understand how that's not a huge part of the US economy. It isn't a driver. It isn't going to be a driving force.
So can it be excluded from these kind of...
Anything can be excluded. Yeah. I mean, this is
like
the point
the
about...
NHS.
This is about, your point about the NHS. There are reservations, there are all kinds of things that are done. What you don't do is negotiate in a public forum, and you don't negotiate in the media.
Given that it's complicated, however much the desire may be simple, realistically, and given what Stella Creasy said, that you can't actually do a deal until they are aware of what our deal is with the EU, how long before you get this deal, which you say will be very important because of its impact elsewhere, even though we will have lost the terms that we have with the EU? How long?
Well, let me just talk about what we can do and what we can't do, because there's a legal issue about what you can do. You can do scoping agreements, you can do discussions, you can do all of that before we actually leave the EU, and then you can't sign the deal until you've actually left the EU. But the issue is not a legal question; it's a political question. It's from the perspective of the US. What do they want to do? What do they think we will be able to do? If they think we're going to not leave the EU, or they think we're going to be part of the customs union for another 5 years, then they may not want to do a deal. But that's their decision. And their president has basically communicated the fact that he thinks that in 2 years, after the triggering of Article 50, we won't be in the customs union, we won't be in the single market. Theresa May has said so. And therefore, they will be able to do the kind of trade deal that they need to do with us. The speed of a trade deal depends on two things. One, how much defensive interest the trading partners have. One of the reasons Europe takes so long to do trade deals, 11 years plus in the case of India, is because there is so much agricultural protectionism in Europe, the CAP and so forth, that they can't actually negotiate the one thing that other countries want to negotiate. So a deal with Europe always takes a long time. The other element that gives you the speed of the deal is the political will on both sides. And in the case of the US and the UK, there is clearly a lot of political will on both sides.
Given that, and given that Martin Lewis thinks he's on this programme to forecast, not entirely, how long would you say?
Well, I will tell you that the US-Canada
piece... We'll hold
piece,
you to it, of course.
Yeah, the US-Canada piece of the NAFTA agreement was a 14-month process. Trade deals have been done in 9 or 10 months. Trade deals sometimes take 3 or 4 years. I would think that in a deal where you have a lot of political will and you don't have a lot of defensive baggage on either side, and you have a lot of offensive interest, which means that we want services access for our financial services industry and our insurance industry, they want the same type of access, could be quite quick. I think it could be done in 2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years, thank you. That 2 to 3 years after Brexit.
Some of that 2 to 3 years will be scoping before we leave the European Union, and some of it will be afterwards.
Okay.